Emmanuel Joseph Raphael Orazi was known professionally as Manuel Orazi, and he was born in Rome in 1860. I can tell you nothing about his family's status or his art education, and I found no examples of what could be considered formative early work. And it wasn't until 1892, when he moved to Paris, that evidence of his illustration began to appear. In addition to a solitary intriguing example from Edgar Allan Poe's Masque of the Red Death in 1893, there are several Art Nouveau style posters, most of which were to promote theatrical productions and operas. Most significantly, in 1895, he created the Calendrier Magique, which was an occult-themed calendar published as a limited edition of 777 copies. And this remarkable body of intense and stylistically distinctive graphic work had no contemporary equivalent I can think of. When spoken of at all, Orazi is generally classified as being Art Nouveau, but this calendar was more Gothic symbolism, a seminal signpost in the evolution of horror illustration, and astonishingly ahead of its time and experimental in graphic terms. In the following year, 1896, he was commissioned to design a poster advertising the Maison de l'Art Nouveau Gallery. And other examples of his work, including a few exclusive jewellery designs, were also exhibited there for the wealthy patrons to buy. He also illustrated novels such as Ma Petite Ville by Jean Leran in 1898, which resonated with a darkness similar to his earlier calendar work, even if not stylistically alike. The book Aventures merveilleuses de Huon de Bordeaux, written by Gaston Paris, was also published in 1898, and this constituted a major success and creative achievement in Orazi's career. It was memorably illustrated and decorated throughout with many beautiful and thoroughly engrossing colour narrative illustrations by Orazi. There is no information regarding his use of graphic media for this or any other illustrated work, but in this instance close examination strongly suggests watercolour, possibly enhanced with crayon. But this is another stab in the dark on my part. His work continued to appear on posters, many but not all connected to musical events. And in 1902 he illustrated another highly successful and critically acclaimed book. This was an edition of Jean Bertheroy's Les Vierges de Syracuse, and once again his colour work for this project was possessed of great sensitivity. Throughout the first decade of the century, Orazi's reputation as one of the leading Parisian graphic artists continued undiminished. But following the publication of his illustrations for the novel Aphrodite by Pierre Louis in 1912, evidence of his work becomes exceptionally thin on the ground, until 1921 when he designed the sets and posters for the silent film L'Atlantide. It's always possible he was concentrating more on painting than illustration. But there's another serious absence of imagery until a return in 1930, when his equally orientalist, highly mannered images for an edition of Oscar Wilde's Salome was published. In 1934 he created one of his most acclaimed projects, a series of exceptionally absorbing, mostly erotic illustrations for Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal. And in addition to the figurative works, he created a series of astoundingly beautiful but sinister florally inspired pages. Sadly, this was also Orazi's last published work, and he died in that year when he was 74 years old. During his lifetime, Donald McGill was well known as one of the most popular humorous illustrators in Britain. His career was spent exclusively creating comic postcards, and although he wasn't the only one working in that market, to most postcards enthusiasts, myself included, he remains the undisputed master of the form. McGill was born in 1875 in London, and in 1891 he enrolled at Blackheath Art School. But formal study didn't suit him at all, and he soon left to take a job as an engineering draftsman at a London ironworks. His entry into the world of comic postcards didn't come until 13 years later in 1904, when through a mutual acquaintance his drawings came to the attention of the owner of the Pictorial Postcard Company. Although these early images had little to distinguish themselves from others working in this market, his cards proved popular, and he was soon able to make a living doing something he actually enjoyed. Early on, his inking was less than subtle, and the colour was usually mechanically and crudely applied at printing. But while others stuck with the same approach and ultimately paid the price commercially, McGill's style evolved quite quickly into much softer watercolour rendering and a finer, more descriptive linear technique. Bizarre as it now seems, when the Great War began in 1914, comic postcards were sent back and forth between the troops and their loved ones back home. And McGill was among the most popular of the artists who exploited the potential humour of military life. And with only a couple of more propagandist exceptions, he produced a series of mostly harmless, jovial compositions portraying troops and civilians back home. Once the war had ended, Britain attempted to return to some kind of normality, and with improved transportation, holidays to the British seaside became immensely popular for ordinary working people. And it's in the 1920s that McGill really had his biggest impact, catering for the booming postcard market and satirising the British at work and play. Fewer than you might imagine of these cards were actually seaside themed, but in McGill's case he started making particular use of vulgar humour. And although he did continue to create cards which were suitable for all the family, it soon became apparent to McGill and his employers that the more suggestive the humour, the more the cards sold. He churned out hundreds of cards in the years that followed, and however vulgar their humour, they were nevertheless a telling record of daily life in Britain. During the Second World War he returned to military themes and even produced some anti-Nazi propaganda cards. And McGill's jovial images continued to be popular into the 1950s. But in that decade the sexually suggestive nature of some of his jokes increasingly led to censorship, and in 1954, when he was 80 years old, he had to face an obscenity trial. He was found guilty and had to pay a relatively small fine, but worse than that, many of his postcards and original artwork were destroyed. McGill produced an estimated 12,000 cards during his lifetime. He was paid on average what would now be around £250 or $300 for each card. And he died in 1962 at the age of 87. Unsurprisingly, his estate was worth just £735. Spanish illustrator and artist José Segrelles was born in Albaida, in the province of Valencia in 1885. He studied at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Valencia, alongside his similarly talented brother. But following his brother's sudden death not long after, he completed his training in Barcelona. His first job was in a photographic studio, but by 1910 he'd begun to create illustration work, mostly for books, and in 1914 his work appeared in a children's edition of the story Hazanas del Cid Campeador. From the outset, the bulk of his illustrations were created using watercolour and gouache, but there are also some more flat graphic images from this period. But it was the painted fantasy work, as evidenced in his dramatic series for the Seven Deadly Sins in 1925, which drew the greatest interest and admiration. In 1926 he had an exhibition of his art at a gallery in London, which led to offers of commercial work from two prominent and respected British magazines, the Sketch and the Illustrated London News, including a remarkably evocative colour series based on the work of various classical composers. In 1927 he also established contacts with American publishers, and a year later he sailed for New York. Once established, he started taking commissions for several American magazines, including Redbook and Cosmopolitan. And it was in the pages of Cosmopolitan that most of his work appeared, alongside the best painterly illustrators the USA had to offer. Even so, he continued to take commissions from British publishers, despite his residence in the USA. And although magazine work kept him more than busy enough, he continued to illustrate works of fiction, such as his visualization of the 1001 Nights in 1932. There are also illustrations for H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds from around the same time. and his facility for dramatic fantasy led to a particularly impressive edition of Edgar Allan Poe's Tales of Mystery and Imagination in 1935, with a series of swirling and frequently menacing watercolours. The 1940s and 50s are unfortunately poorly recorded, and other than a totally new visualisation of the 1001 Nights published in 1956, I can't with any accuracy pinpoint specific images. Nevertheless, this selection of illustrations is a clear indication of the persistence of his skill and imagination. In 1966, at the age of 80, his visually stunning edition of the story of Don Quixote was published, and this series of engrossing narrative images formed a particularly suitable commission with which to end his remarkable career. And José Segres died in the town of his birth in 1969 at the age of 83. Eryk Lipinski was born in Krakow, Poland in 1908, the son of the respected artist Theodor Lipinski. In 1913 he moved to Moscow with his family, but in 1921 they returned to Poland and settled in Warsaw, where he later went on to study at the Academy of Fine Arts up to 1934. Even so, he had already been working professionally as early as 1928, when he was first published in the magazine Pobudka. And in 1935 he co-founded the satirical weekly Szpilki and worked as its editor-in-chief for the next 2 years. During the Second World War he was active in the Polish resistance, forging documents and helping others escape, but he was caught and held prisoner in several concentration camps, including Auschwitz, for the rest of the war. Amazingly, he came out alive. Following the war he published 1945 Farewell to Hitler, and returned to his role at Szpilki up to 1953. But he also created a large volume of other work, including the children's picture book about a strange dog, O Piesko Divaku, published in 1945, and which became very popular. There's also evidence of another book, Kolorowi Wagoniki, with many pleasing cut-out style angular pictures, but I can find no date of publication for it. In the post-war years he became particularly prolific as a poster artist, using a remarkably eclectic and visually distinctive modernist graphic approach. Everything he created was visually playful and occasionally surreal in nature, and he varied his use of media, levels of representation, and application of colour wildly. Many of his posters were for Polish films and Polish releases of foreign films, but there was none of the usual slavish reproduction of the actors involved. He was just as popular and imaginative when it came to bookwork, and he created cover designs for a large number during his later career. He continued to work well into later life, and Eryk Lipinski died at the age of 83 in Warsaw in 1991. So that's another 4 for the archive, and 4 more are on their way. I hope to see you then.